escalation now looms large. On February 24, 2022, the day of Russia's invasion, the German Navy mobilized its forces.
It was a very spontaneous and very intense response. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which was a violation of international law, we sent everything that could float into the Baltic Sea.
How should NATO respond to Russia's aggression? It's a question that's now being asked across the region. The Baltic states, which were once part of the Soviet Union, have called for a united front against Putin.
We can't have this plan to, defend the country alone and then be liberated afterwards.
St. Petersburg is one of Russia's few access points to the Baltic Sea. From here, Russia's leadership is determined to stake its claim as an imperial power on the seas.
Our Navy is capable of responding with lightning speed to anyone who wants to encroach on our sovereignty and freedom. It executes strategic tasks successfully and honorably.
Russia is also threatening to use nuclear weapons that could easily reach every city in Europe.
I am afraid of nuclear weapons. Yes, I'm afraid. Also because I live in Berlin.
Today, almost the entire Baltic Sea is surrounded by NATO member states and NATO ally Sweden. Russia has only two access points, Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg.
NATO has direct access to strategic positions in the Baltic Sea, for example, the island of Gotland, but also airfields in Finland, among other places. So Russian naval access to the Baltic Sea could be blocked in the event of war.
It was a very different picture before the fall of the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, the Baltic Sea was almost entirely surrounded by Warsaw Pact countries, the Soviet Union and its satellite states, and by the neutral states of Finland and Sweden. It was a position of power which Putin appears to want back. But today, the de facto balance of power on the world's oceans is undeniable. NATO has 16 aircraft carriers. Russia has 1. NATO has 13 helicopter carriers. Russia has none. NATO has 135 frigates. Russia has 11. NATO has over 2,000 military ships under its command. Russia has just under 600. But Russia's underwater capabilities are formidable. The country has more than 40 nuclear-powered submarines, around 10 armed with nuclear weapons.
Russian leadership thinks of Russia as of superpower, and the only reason why it can be considered to be a superpower is the fact that its nuclear arsenal is biggest of all, except for the United States. They do play this card all the time, and that's why the weaker they are in terms of conventional weapons, the stronger is their temptation to use or to threaten using nuclear weapons.
But the relationship between Russia and the West on the Baltic Sea was not always as fractured as it is today. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel and President Vladimir Putin sought regular contact, apparently hoping to maintain good economic relations. But then things changed.
I'd say the final break came in September 2012. Putin had decided to remain in power forever, that there would be no more transition of power. And for that, he needed an external enemy, a superhuman enemy. And you can't find a better enemy than NATO.
The Soviet Union had collapsed, but NATO remained, and even gained new members. For Putin, the NATO expansion is fundamental to his narrative.
Russia sees NATO as its main adversary, the one that poses the greatest threat, at least from the Russian perspective, and not just in military terms. Some Moscow elites fear that NATO is planning a kind of coup d'etat to depose the government.
Rostock is a strategically important naval base and home to the German Naval Command. Vice Admiral Frank Lenski is one of the country's highest-ranking officers, but his task is not purely a military one.
The Baltic Sea is an international body of water, and economically speaking, it's extremely important to maintain open shipping routes there. That's also true for Russia, by the way. At least 1/3 of its imports and exports pass through St. Petersburg, so Russia also has a great deal of interest in keeping the Baltic Sea routes open.
The Dillingen is a German mine-hunting vessel. It patrols the Baltic Sea, along with many other NATO vessels. For a long time, the underwater threat here was largely theoretical.
This is a military vessel used to detect the presence or absence of mines. We have the sensors to detect them and the equipment to destroy them. In addition to that, we can also lay mines ourselves.
The mission has become broader and more dangerous. Since the start of the invasion of Ukraine, new threats have emerged, such as underwater attacks on pipelines and threats to internet and power cables.
We now have a new responsibility, conducting underwater monitoring. We observe any changes on the seabed and monitor it at frequent intervals. After leaving port, our first assignment was to support the investigation of the attacks on the Nord Stream pipeline.
Lieutenant Fritz can't provide any details. The mission is classified. Who exactly carried out the attack is still a matter of speculation.
Besatzung auf, Gefechtsstation, Besatzung auf, Gefechtsstation.
The crew on the Dillingen conduct frequent drills to prepare for emergencies, like defending the ship from a direct assault.
Ja, Speedboot hat aufgestockt. Befehl, weiter observe. Ja, ja. Stopper 10, Backbord 10, Backbord 10. Ja.
One scenario is an attack by terrorists on a speedboat.
So, die Neue durch. Ja, Mitschiffs. 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 Ja. Hey, 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 hey. So, die Neue durch.
Russian warships are still deployed on the Baltic.
Encounters with Russian ships do happen. The Baltic Sea is also their home turf after all. So we do have encounters like that, but they all take place under the principles of good seamanship. It's like a gentleman's agreement, in which you don't hinder another vessel's progress. But of course, we keep a close eye on what they're doing, and if there's anything unusual, it's reported and gets evaluated.
Those reports are also strictly classified.
Raummobilitätskontrollen im gesamten Boot durchführen. Stärkemeldung an die Besatzung auf Start der Station. So, ausrüsten. Ja.
Neukurs 120. Ja.
NATO, Finland, and Sweden have also conducted joint naval exercises, even before Finland joined NATO.
Our cooperation is very, very close. For several years now, we've seen frequent invitations to take part in international maneuvers. It's not unusual for the Finnish and Swedish navies to join us on exercises.
Sweden and Finland particularly feel the threat from Russia. Sweden has applied for NATO membership. Finland joined in 2023. Its border with Russia is more than 1,300 kilometers long.
Finland had always been neutral. It made a deliberate decision to remain outside of NATO for a very long time. It based its security strategy on remaining neutral and maintaining, I would say, balanced or even good relations with Russia as much as possible, even during the Cold War.
At the same time, Finland maintained a strong military, especially along its Russian border. Its strategy, the best possible relations with Russia and the best possible defense against it.
This cost-benefit calculation has fundamentally changed since the war against Ukraine.
Boris Pistorius became Germany's defense minister in January 2023.
I want to emphasize again that Germany is by a clear margin the highest contributor to Ukraine in the European Union. We are proud to provide this support because we believe it is important and necessary, and after the USA, we are on par with Great Britain. Every military conflict, every war of aggression against a sovereign state always carries the risk of escalation.
Jens Stoltenberg, the Norwegian Secretary General of NATO, has been a key advocate of NATO enlargement in Europe from the start.
Russia's attack on Ukraine is more than an attack on Ukraine. It's a devastating, horrendous attack on innocent people in Ukraine, but it's also an attack on the whole European security order, and that's the reason why we take it so extremely seriously.
Stoltenberg also regularly travels to Stockholm to meet with Swedish Defense Minister Paul Jonsson and offer his support for the country's efforts to join NATO.
Since the outbreak of war on February 24th, it's been clear that Russia is prepared to take major military and political risks. We have to be prepared for that. One thing we've learned from this war is that if you want to have access to Article 5, to NATO's defense guarantees and NATO's defense planning, you have to be a full member of NATO.
NATO headquarters in Brussels. Although Russia wanted to weaken the alliance, the attack on Ukraine has had the opposite effect. In May 2022, Finland and Sweden submitted their official letter of application to join NATO.
When the two countries submitted their applications, I realized we were witnessing history in the making. After all, both countries were neutral for a long time. Sweden for more than 200 years, and the Finns became neutral toward the alliance in the 1950s, though not entirely voluntarily. We've been working closely with both countries, so it was an exciting, big moment.
The Swedish Defense University in Stockholm is an elite school for future military leaders. Jakob Westberg, an internationally recognized expert in war studies, teaches here. The halls are steeped in history.
Once it emerged that Sweden and Finland would apply for NATO membership, the Russian government basically said, "That's no surprise to us. You've been part of that Western world for a long time." It was a weak response, probably because it was a major strategic defeat for Russia, and they didn't want to admit that.
A military parade in Moscow on May 9th, 2023 marked the 78th anniversary of the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. The Kremlin itself has brought NATO even closer to Russia's borders with its war against Ukraine. And yet, people in Russia don't see this as a defeat, as Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made clear at the United Nations on April 25th, 2023.
The
claim is that Russia tried to prevent NATO expansion. That's how they see it from their ivory tower. We too have our ivory towers. And the conclusions of unbiased observers and political analysts in Russia and abroad is that NATO wanted to break up the Russian Federation, but ended up uniting it.
Nikolai Petrov is a Russian security expert who lives in exile in Germany.
It's easy to present whatever is going as victorious moves for Russia. And even defeats in this war, which could be seen as humiliating defeats, are considered to be not that much defeats because Russia opposes not Ukraine, it opposes the whole West, it opposes NATO, which is much stronger, but nevertheless Russia is doing pretty well in view of Kremlin's propagandists and generally population.
Olga Romanova is a well-known journalist and human rights activist in Russia. She also lives in exile in Germany.
Putin can afford to lose this war, any war. He's acting according to the Churchill doctrine. Churchill said if Napoleon had had the Pravda newspaper, no one would ever have known that he lost the Battle of Waterloo. Putin can afford to lose the Ukraine war. He'll just convince the Russian people that they're actually winning the war.
In Stockholm, the United States made clear it also stands behind Sweden's bid to join NATO.
Mr. Minister, thanks for hosting me today, and thanks for the warm welcome, and a special thanks for this great weather. First, you have made the bold and historic decision to apply for NATO membership. And you have the full and firm support of the United States.
But what will NATO gain from the membership of these two countries, which may be geographically large, but have a relatively small population, only 16 million people in all?
Looking at the militaries of Sweden and Finland, it's evident that they both have well-equipped and powerful armed forces. They'll contribute to NATO's defensive capabilities, while adding little to NATO's costs.
These Visby-class corvette warships belonging to the Swedish Navy are state-of-the-art.
We have a strong naval force. We build and design submarines and operate them in the Baltic Sea. We have a skilled fleet with modern corvettes and the ability to operate in coastal areas. We also have a strong defense industry in Sweden. There's no other country in the world with 10 million inhabitants that can build and design both submarines and combat aircraft.
Another important factor is Gotland, a Swedish island in the Baltic Sea.
Gotland is one of three strategically important islands in the Baltic Sea region. Bornholm is another. It's a Danish territory, not all that far from Russia's Kaliningrad, and just past the entryway to the Baltic Sea. So Gotland is not the only significant island, but it's like an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a place where military forces can be stationed.
The Baltic Sea was also on the front lines during the Cold War, when Germany was still divided, and the countries of NATO and the Warsaw Pact were enemies. The balance of power in the region at that time is difficult to assess. Military strength is not just about the number of ships and soldiers. It's also a question of the quality of the ships, weapons, and training for the crews. Overall, the Warsaw Pact forces probably had an edge. This is a rocket corvette, a warship from the former East German Volksmarine, the People's Navy. In the 1980s, Holger Neidl captained a ship much like this one.
We had 4 missiles on board with a range of 80 kilometers and an altitude of 25 to 50 meters. So our mission was to destroy the enemy's surface forces, mainly enemy rocket launchers, enemy mine layers, the enemy's offensive forces.
These photos from the 1980s document everyday life on board. In retrospect, it seems like the calm before the storm.
Most of the large vessels in the Soviet fleet would have been moved to the Atlantic to fight enemy forces there. Our aim was to take control of the straits from our side, the Danish Straits, and then extend our control.
Ingo Pfeiffer also served as captain in the East German Navy on the Baltic Sea. During the Cold War, these normally calm waters became very dangerous.
The Baltic Sea was the marine region with the highest concentration of naval forces and air forces. According to my research, about 1,350 naval vessels were stationed here in the Baltic Sea area. That includes NATO naval forces, the Warsaw Pact fleet, and Finland and Sweden as neutral states. There were also about 600 helicopters and airplanes. This marine region had the largest concentration of military forces in the world.
NATO and the Warsaw Pact states were constantly preparing for war. The two sides were engaged in an arms race, including in the Baltic Sea. A major confrontation appeared imminent, and both sides feared that the other might resort to nuclear weapons. And yet, it did not come to war. So how volatile was the situation really?
Much later on in my research, I read documents that said the Warsaw Pact military leadership, in other words the Soviet armed forces, had good reason to believe that NATO was not planning to start a war. But that's not what we believed in former East Germany. We were always supposed to be ready for war, even on the weekends. The ships were required to be at 80% capacity, because even when the West German Navy was off work, a war might be launched on the weekend. What rubbish!
Today, many believe the Baltic states are particularly vulnerable. They were once part of the Soviet Union, and Russia appears to yearn for the days of Soviet greatness. In March 2022, Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas paid a visit to NATO headquarters in Brussels. She urged the Allies to help protect Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to deter Moscow.
I think we have to double our efforts. Putin cannot win this war. This is very important to all of us, to the security of NATO as well. And the second thing we need to discuss is how to increase our defense spending and how to do it very wisely so that we strengthen the eastern flank, and especially the Baltic countries, because we can't have this plan to defend the country alone and then be liberated afterwards. So that's why we need to become from the deterrence posture to defense plans and to very specific things to strengthen our part of the alliance.
Putin не считает страны Балтии чем-то серьезным для себя, для России.
Putin believes that any of his tank divisions could invade Estonia or Lithuania or Latvia, and no one would resist him. To him, it doesn't matter one bit that these countries joined NATO in 2004.
Это тоже страны, которые вступили в НАТО в 2004 году.
NATO is militarily superior to Russia, and Russia needs to understand that, so that they don't even consider, after attacking Ukraine, also attacking another neighbor, or the Baltic states. Our Baltic partners kept telling us this was a real threat. We nodded our heads, but for us, the idea that these kind of imperialistic delusions still existed seemed crazy.
The Laga airbase is not far from Rostock, near the Baltic Sea. 2 large Eurofighter squadrons are stationed here, with more than 70 aircraft in total. From here, they also protect the Baltic states. Several times a day, Eurofighters take off from Laga to secure the airspace. The Eurofighter Typhoon is a well-equipped aircraft. For combat situations, the fighter jet features up to 3 external fuel tanks, as well as GPS and laser-guided missiles for aerial and air-to-ground combat. NATO has stepped up its military exercises to test its combat readiness. Orion 23, a multi-phase exercise, included one of the largest tactical landing exercises in decades. It simulated the invasion of a smaller country by its larger neighbor, training how to defend against the invader.
Our airborne troops enable us to strike fast, hard, and far. It's a unique combat situation for the French army, because it allows us to cross the front lines and strike at enemy airfields.
Baltops 23 was a large-scale naval exercise in the Baltic Sea. As a show of force, the most advanced American aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, arrived in European waters at the same time. NATO and allied forces are constantly training to defend against an attack. Air Defender 23 was the largest deployment exercise of air forces in NATO's history. Do all of these military exercises risk provoking Russia?
We've been conducting Baltops for decades. This is one of several regular exercises we carry out at the Baltic Sea. Just like the Northern Coast exercise, Russia carries out similar exercises. At the end of the day, these exercises and maneuvers are an essential part of maintaining your armed forces. That's why it's not unusual for armed forces who are deployed as a deterrent to carry out exercises, which also sends the signal that we are in a position to take successful action if need be.
Over the last 10 to 15 years, a specific logic tended to shape our policy towards Russia. The mantra was, don't provoke Russia in order to avoid war. But with Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine, many people, including political decision-makers, have finally understood that the central issue is not one of Western provocation. It's Moscow's own worldview, which is largely impervious to outside influence.
In 1985, a large-scale Baltops, or Baltic operation, was carried out. Back then, it was certainly a provocation. The maneuver in the Baltic was in the Soviet Union's backyard. The USS Iowa was an enormous battleship, 270 meters long and 33 meters wide, larger than the Titanic. Today, it's docked in Los Angeles as a floating museum ship. In 1985, it was believed to have had nuclear capabilities.
This, of course, caused a stir among the Warsaw Pact leadership. It was, after all, a large combat ship with 16-inch guns on 3 turrets and 32 cruise missiles on board. It was the first nuclear-equipped carrier to sail into the Baltic Sea, courtesy of the US Navy.
These photos were taken by the East German Navy. The USS Iowa was a symbol of NATO's strength and of the decline of the Warsaw Pact.
Soviet Admiral Gorshkov later mentioned in a speech to members of the US Navy that they were very surprised and impressed by US naval technology. He praised the US Navy and the combat power of their ships and admitted that we couldn't stand up to them.
At the same time, in 1985, secret plans were unfolding at Cape Arcona on the East German island of Rügen. Here lies a relic of the past, a former East German bunker on the far tip of the island. Holger Neidl, the former corvette captain in the East German Navy, knows what it was used for.
In the event of war, the bunker was intended to ensure that the High Command remained operational. It was originally planned to house 70 men. The bunker covers 2,000 square meters and was built by soldiers from the Sassnitz Naval and Construction Battalions. While it was still under construction in 1985, a photo of the open excavation pit was published in a book about the Eastern German military. By the time someone realized what had happened, it was too late. Some of the books had already been sold. The remaining copies were destroyed, but